Um, Good evening, everybody. Uh, Tonight we are joined by an esteemed guest, Dr. Ramzy Baroud, uh, who who is a U.S. Palestinian journalist, media consultant, and author, international syndicated columnist, editor of Palestine Chronicle since 1999, former editor of London-based Middle East Eye, former editor-in-chief of the Brunei Times, and former deputy managing editor of Al Jazeera Online. Holding a PhD in Palestine Studies from the University of Exeter, Mr. Baroud has also taught mass communication at Australia's Curtin University of Technology, Malaysia campus. He's also the author of 6 books and a contributor to many others. His latest volume, co-edited with Ilan Pape, is Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. He also frequently appears in and writes for international media outlets, including the Middle East Eye, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, TRT. Also, please note that, as far as I know, some of his books have been translated into Turkish. So tonight is the title of his lecture is quite interesting and quite relevant to the time that we are having, especially after October 7, the portrayal of Palestine refugees in global media. So as you all know, at the end of his lecture, I will be asking your questions to him. So you can write your questions to the chat bar, directly sending it to the Afrika Vakfı account. Mr. Baroud, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We are happy to see you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brother Yusuf. And it's my great pleasure and honor indeed to participate in this important series in the summer school. And I hope that I can make the kind of contribution that could be somewhat meaningful and fitting for your purposes and consistent more or less with the kind of narrative that has also been produced or content that has been produced by your other esteemed speakers and guests who I have been following very closely since the start of this series. Before we talk about the portrayal of Palestinian refugees in global media, I think we need to talk about the Palestinian refugees themselves and why this issue remains very, very important. Now, our understanding is that the refugees, Palestinian refugees, were the direct outcome of the Nakba. The Nakba, as you all know, means catastrophe, is the catastrophic destruction of the Palestinian homeland at the hands of Zionist militias between December, towards the end of 1947, all the way to early or mid 1949. The Nakba has been crystallized in a particular date, which is May 15th, 1948, while in actuality it was a process that extended beyond that date, before that date, and long after that date. In fact, in Palestinian lexicon, we believe in the term al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the continuous Nakba. Why is that the case? Because the Nakba is not a particular event in history that can be referred to in a specific set of dates. The Nakba is a collective experience. And the Zionist tactics that later became the Israeli tactics have really ensured that not only that the injustices created by the Nakba, including the crisis of Palestinian refugees, have never been remedied. Not just that, but the same practices continue to be used until today. Instead of mass expulsion of Palestinians, as took place during the Nakba, but again during the Naksa or the 1967 war, where hundreds of thousands of people are being pushed out all at the same time, more or less. There is a different kind of practice that we call the incremental genocide or the incremental Nakba. In other words, the daily ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, whether in Sheikh Jarrah or in the southern Hebron Hills or in the Jerusalem area, and now in Gaza itself. What Israel is trying to do in Gaza, as per the words of an Israeli minister, that, it is time for Nakba 2.0, meaning that what we have done in 1947-48, we should be doing again now. Because the Gaza war has created an opportunity for that kind of mass expulsion of Palestinians to take place. So the Israelis have long denied, and I think this is kind of interesting, at least to me, they have long denied that the Nakba is a thing. They don't teach it in their schools, they don't teach it in their universities. Our Nakba for them is their day of independence. So they give us the impression that the Nakba is a marginal issue that only exists in the imagination of Palestinians and those who support them. But when the Gaza war started, suddenly Israeli media, Israeli politicians began talking about, well, it is time for another Nakba, which means that the actual Nakba, the original Nakba, was never really marginal in their mindset, but it was very center to it. They just did not want to acknowledge it, using our own terminology, the Nakba, to say that this issue is completely irrelevant and it doesn't matter to us. In fact, during the Oslo Accords, between those who purportedly spoke on behalf of the Palestinian people within the PLO, or within a specific faction of the PLO, and later becoming the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, during the Oslo Accords, they have agreed to postpone the issue of the Nakba, or the discussion on the refugees and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. They agreed to postpone it into what they call the final status negotiations. Now, that was in the early 1990s, extending all the way to 1994, 1993, 1994, even 1995. And the final status negotiations were supposed to be sorted out sometimes in 1999. Neither the final status negotiations took place, nor a discussion on the refugees took place. And that date came and went without any meaningful acknowledgement of this most central issue to the Palestinian cause. Now, what do I mean by the most central issue to the Palestinian cause? One of the main problems, and many of us contributed to the problem of the perception of the Palestinian refugees, is we have enunciated that issue, we have discussed that issue and underlined that issue as purely a humanitarian issue. That was cemented with the creation of UNRWA, a specific United Nations organization that operates outside the UN the UN Refugees Agency, that is dedicated to Palestinian refugees. UNRWA, over time, never really acquired any political meaning. It's our interpretation of UNRWA that's political, but UNRWA itself is purely humanitarian organization dedicated to the welfare of Palestinian refugees. I grew up in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, and I remember how much I hated having to go to an UNRWA building to acquire the daily ration of a sandwich, half an egg, sometimes a full apple, but usually very, very small little green apples, and the like. I hated it because it just felt so humiliating that my existence is being reduced to someone who needed to be fed so he doesn't die. And indeed, most of the kids in my school were malnourished, and they needed that UNRWA handout, but I didn't like it personally because I felt that it was truly demeaning to the Palestinian experience. And I kind of developed that consciousness. Well, my dad was very much involved in the resistance movement in Gaza, so I kind of had that kind of early, political consciousness. But others also did not like the way that our relationship with UNRWA has been reduced to that of standing in line, whether the monthly rations coming from UNRWA, which includes, a small sack of rice and small sack of flowers, few usually and always used shoes and clothes donated by some nation, some people very far away, or the daily handouts to students who are pupils at various UNRWA schools. Over time, the issue of Palestinian refugees has therefore been reduced from being a political issue to that of being a humanitarian issue. And now it's back to the surface. But Israel does not think of UNRWA as a humanitarian organization, and Israel does not think of the refugees as a humanitarian crisis, because the political meaning of the refugees have changed over time. So by relegating the issue of the Palestinian refugees to that of the final status negotiations is an affront to history, an affront to the actual crisis taking place in Palestine. The crisis of the Palestinian people is a crisis of a people. And that crisis of the Palestinian peoples and those people started during the Nakba of 1948, where you have 750,000. When we say 750,000 Palestinian refugees became refugees during the Nakba, it doesn't actually tell the full story. Those are the people who were registered with UNRWA as such. But you have a large number of Palestinians who were never registered with UNRWA, because they ended up leaving or being pushed into areas that were not under the direct or in areas in which UNRWA did not have operations in those places. So, for example, if I was a Palestinian who ended up going to I had a family or whomever in the United States or in Chile, in South America or in Africa or in Asia, beyond the scope of operation of UNRWA, I was never registered as an UNRWA refugee. So when we say 750,000 Palestinian refugees were expelled from their homes in Palestine in 1947-48, that is not an accurate number. That just related to those who were registered with UNRWA as such. And when we say currently, those refugees or the descendants of those refugees are, and I found two different numbers, 5.4 million and 5.6 million Palestinian refugees. Today, they are actually the refugees registered with UNRWA as such. So if I'm a Palestinian registered with UNRWA as a refugee, and I am, but I had a family and I raised my kids somewhere else and I never got the chance or the opportunity to register them with UNRWA, even though they are from a political point of view, in fact, should be from a legal point of view. They are also refugees because they are descendants of a refugee. They are not actually counted as such. That is, I think it's quite important. But with time, the issue of refugees acquired that a humanitarian idea to it, but in actuality, it is a political idea. It's a human right for Palestinians to go back to their homes. That issue of Palestinians returning to their homes has never really been satisfied, not in any possible way. And as a result, the original crisis of the Palestinian crisis, the epicenter of that crisis, that of the refugees, remain in place. So there can never be peace, there can never be justice, there can never be a so-called solution without acknowledging the centrality of Palestinian refugees, the right of those refugees to be repatriated or compensated according to international law, particularly United Nations Resolution 194, that gives them that right, and that law remains valid and is acknowledged time and again on an annual basis by the United Nations General Assembly. Now, Israel knows that the issue of refugees is a political issue. They know that, and they are acting accordingly. And we Palestinians know that, and we act accordingly. If you guys recall the what we call the Great March of Return, I think it started sometime in 2018, if I remember correctly, in Gaza, where tens of thousands and at times hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would descend to the fence separating besieged Gaza from Israel, and they demand their right of return, at the same time demanding the end of the Israeli siege on Gaza. Now, these are, many of them were third, if not even fourth generation Palestinian refugees. Why is the issue of the right of return so central to their very existence? How come it registered so well in the collective psyche of the Palestinian people, to the point that while they are under siege, suffering from recurring Israeli wars, the vast majority of them, in fact, the vast majority of Gaza, never actually stepped a foot outside Gaza, yet their main demand is the right of return to their own homes. And for Israel, this is terrifying, because the initial idea in Israel that once you push them out, they are going to forget, they are going to move on, because this is really the experience of refugees. I'll give you an example. I had a friend of mine, we worked together in a London-based organization years and years ago called the Right of Palestinian Return Center. And we hired him to do a specific project in the Palestinian refugee camps in South Lebanon. He had a PhD in refugee studies, and he was discussing refugee experiences following World War II, particularly concerning, certain parts of Eastern Europe and the like. So when he became involved in the Palestinian refugee question, we sent him to Ain al-Hilwi, we sent him to other refugee camps in Lebanon, and he came back with this kind of astonishing realization, at least for him. And he said, all the studying that I have done, all the research, all the experience in trying to understand the refugee mindset, the collective refugee mindset, is so different from the refugee experience of the Palestinians, or the Palestinian refugees' experience. He said, usually refugees in general, of course, it's not fair to apply this to every single refugee, individual or family or even community, but he says in general, when we are talking about collectives made of millions, he said what tends to happen, the first generation tends to hold on their memories, on their tradition, on their culture, on their connection to the homeland. But with time, that relationship starts fizzling out, because they become involved in new economic patterns in these new communities in which they live, whether in the UK, France, Germany, Spain, the United States, Canada, and so forth. He said the second generation is usually different. There's no strong tug of going back to the homeland. Even if they are capable of doing so, they move on with their lives. The third generation, it's a story that no longer matters. He said, but what I noticed for second, third generation Palestinians, at the time, the fourth generation hasn't yet been a generation, but he said up to the third generation of Palestinians, is that they speak about their villages in Palestine, the 500 villages and towns that were destroyed by Israeli Zionist gangs and militias in 1947-48. He said they speak about it as if it is something that they just left yesterday. They describe the homes from which their ancestors have left. They sing the songs of several generations ago. They still refer to themselves, and this is something I relate to, as peasants, fallahin. They see themselves as political fallahin. I am a fallah, I am a peasant. I don't think I've ever planted anything in my life, and I think if I do, I don't think I'm going to be very good at it. But why do we start, even within our own society, if you ask me in Gaza, you would say fallah or madani, a peasant or city dweller, I would say fallah. peasant. And if you say, where are you from? I'm not going to tell you what is my refugee camp in Gaza. I'm not going to say, well, I am from Nusayrat. I would say, I am from Beit Daras. What is Beit Daras? Beit Daras is one of the approximately 500 Palestinian towns and villages that were destroyed by the Israeli gangs, by the Zionists in 1948. My connection, my rapport, my bond is still connecting me to a village that has been erased from the map entirely, with hundreds of its inhabitants been killed in what we know as the Great Massacre of Beit Daras. And I wrote about this extensively in my previous books. And its people are scattered all over the world. All over the world, you'll have descendants of people from Beit Daras. And yet my connection remains to Beit Daras. So for us, this is no longer an issue of land per se, but the representation of the land. Beit Daras is my connection to Palestine, and it's my connection to my rights and the rights of my children and the rights of my parents who are no longer with us. It's a generational fight for rights and for justice. And Israel knows that, and they know it very well. But since they cannot remove that idea, I mean, how do you remove the idea of that nature from the minds of a collective of millions who are so insistent on it? They tried to remove UNRWA itself. Kind of quite a pathetic attempt, to be honest with you, because we never really connected to the right of return to UNRWA. As long as UNRWA is there, our right of return will always be protected. Of course, that has never been the case anyway, but it is a sign of desperation. Now, Israel has tried to remove that idea from the minds of Palestinians. Number one, by denying that there is a thing as a refugee problem or a crisis to be addressed, by rejecting United Nations Resolution 194, among others, by refusing to acknowledge that there is an issue to be discussed as part of the so-called peace process and the Oslo Accords, and relegating the issue to a final status negotiation that hasn't taken place. But certain systematic things also happened after the Oslo Accords. The renaming of Palestinian refugee camps. They tried to rename the refugee camps into towns. So instead of saying the Nusayrat refugee camp, they tried to call it the town of Nusayrat. And they thought by doing so, they are going to invite this new relationship between the new refugee generation and the place in which they live. So because as long as I acknowledge that I live in a refugee camp, as long as I acknowledge that I'm a refugee, and if I'm a refugee, I come from somewhere, and that somewhere is inside Israel right now. My village is captive inside Israel. But if I change the name, they thought, then, well, you no longer have a place to return to because you come from a town, not from a refugee camp. Well, that has failed. If you watch the news right now, nobody refers to the town of Nusayrat, or the town of Jabalia, or the town of Bureij or Maghazi or Khan Yunis. They refer to the refugee camps of Nusayrat, Maghazi, and Bureij, and so forth. So even that did not work. So now Israel is going after UNRWA itself. Now the attempt to destroy UNRWA as the humanitarian, but in a kind of, in a different way, also the political embodiment of the Palestinian refugee issue, then you are also here looking at, possibly removing the last frontier that makes Palestinian refugees refugees. And that started before the war, particularly a gentleman by the name of Jared Kushner, who has led this process. Now, Jared Kushner is a very intelligent person per his own acknowledgement. He speaks often about how many books he read on the Middle East, and that qualifies him to determine the fate of millions of Palestinian refugees, including my own, by going to various Arab countries and tries to convince them to incorporate Palestinian refugees who are living, for example, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, to become citizens of these countries. If you do so, they have a completely different connection, and then they supposedly, which is absolutely wrong from a legal point of view, supposedly automatically drop the status of being a refugee. I'm a US citizen, but I'm still a Palestinian refugee. If he was actually as smart as he thought he was, he would have paid attention to this little caveat in international law. If a refugee is a citizen in a different country, does not automatically drop his relationship to being a refugee. So he goes to the king of Jordan and he offers him several $billions. And he says, you know what, you have about, I don't know, 2.2 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan who at least registered with UNRWA. Why don't you just incorporate them into Jordanian society and, you know, cancel the whole concept of the refugee camps and all of that, and the problem is solved. It didn't work out, but it didn't work out not because the Arabs are so keen on protecting the rights of the Palestinians. That's a different story. It has a lot more to do with how some Arab countries also see Palestinians as a demographic problem. Now, for Israel, we are a demographic problem, or even worse, we are a demographic bomb. You know, you can't really perceive from an Israeli point of view a Palestinian unless you think of it in terms of, you know, explosions. So we're a demographic bomb, because if we explode, what's going to happen is that we are going to overwhelm the Jewish majority that lives between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. And by doing so, Israel can no longer claim to be a Jewish state only. Well, some Arab governments also have that kind of concern as well. So as a result, we remain refugees from all points of views and under all political considerations. When Jared Kushner was shopping for those who would remove the Palestinian refugees from their status as refugees deserving rights, justice, and reparations, international media didn't really, especially American media, did not deal with the issue as, wait a minute, this is an opportunity to contextualize the Palestinian refugees within proper historical framework. Who are these refugees? Why did they become refugees? Why do they remain refugees? What does international law says about these refugees? What is United Nations Resolution 194? What does this say exactly? Wasn't Israel's very existence conditioned on the acceptance of certain United Nations resolutions regarding Palestine, including Resolution 194? Why is Israel a full UN member despite the fact that it does not acknowledge or honors the United Nations resolution that it was supposedly was supposed to honor in order for it to become a full UN member? Where do these refugees live? And how is that related to what's taking place in Gaza? For example, 70% of all Gazans are refugees. Where do they come from? Why are the places that are the toughest in terms of resistance in Palestine are the places in which it's associated with refugees? There's so many layers to this story of refugees. This is not about standing in line to get an stale UNRWA apple or a sandwich. This is a very complex psychological, political, social issue that goes to the very heart of the question of justice in Palestine. It was a huge mistake deferring it to so-called final status negotiations. But why aren't they talking about it? And when they had the chance to talk about it, why didn't they talk about it? To the extent that acknowledging that there is a refugee issue that has to be, discussed as part of the overall solution to whatever is going to happen in Palestine, places one in the category of extremism. And you will say, wait a minute, you're pushing the boundaries here. Extremism? I mean, we're talking about international law here. I mean, even countries that are in the West acknowledge UN Resolution 194. Western countries acknowledge that. Why is that extremism? Well, let me tell you. There's an interesting, among the many depictions that I found regarding the issue of refugees, there's one that's really kind of got my attention because I feel that it kind of goes to the very heart of the media perception of the issue of refugees. This is written by Yossi Klein Halevi, 2001, in the Los Angeles Times. You don't need me to tell you what the Los Angeles Times, one of the top newspapers in the United States, as mainstream as they come. This is what she says. Yasser Arafat's refusal to abandon the right of return of several million Palestinian I'm reading too fast. Yasser Arafat's refusal to abandon the right of return, refusal to abandon the right of return of several million Palestinian refugees to Israel proper belies his tentative acceptance of President Clinton's final Middle East peace proposal. The right of return, thank you for the context. Halabi decided to give us some context. What is this right of return that she puts in parentheses, or that he puts in a parentheses? The right of return is a euphemism for the destruction of Israel through demographic assault. I mean, should I pause here? Nothing about international law, nothing about the question of justice, nothing about the fact that, yes, indeed, these millions of Palestinian refugees were made refugees by Israel. No acknowledgement of that issue, but the acknowledgement is of two things: the context, and that this is saying right of return, saying, I want to destroy Israel through a demographic assault. So you know what that makes you? And I've been called that personally, giving a lecture at the University of Virginia many years ago. I was told that asking for the right of return makes you equivalent to Hitler. And I was like, Hitler? Really? Are we talking about the same Hitler? Yes, Hitler. Why, sir? He says, well, because Hitler destroyed the Jewish people and you are calling for the total destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. That makes you Hitler. Okay. The other thing is that Yossi talks about here is refusal to abandon. Why should he abandon? Why should we abandon? I mean, if this is international law, this is not Hamas constitution. This is not a statement by Fatah or the Islamic Jihad. This is not Ramzy's personal opinion. This is international law. And international law experts and United Nations envoy, including human rights envoy and peace envoy and so forth, they say this is still very much valid and this is a core issue for Palestinians. Why should Yasser Arafat abandon? And it's his stubbornness, mind you, his refusal to abandon this so-called right of return, which is wink, wink, this very destruction of Israel, is what has basically demolished any prospect for peace in the Middle East. This is the Los Angeles Times, and this is how Western American media in particular discuss the issue. It's either you go for it directly, as in, or even if you want to put it in a polite way, by not as Yossi Halabi has put it, as this is I think this is what the right of return means. No. Some people would be a little bit more detached and they would say something to the effect of Israel considers the right of return an equivalent to the destruction of the Jewish state and so forth. So this is the context. This is the right of return. As far as the Israelis and the American media is concerned, very, very rare do you actually find an article, a statement, a news report, a context, a program, on TV program that would discuss the right of return within its proper boundaries, starting with the legality of and the rights of the Palestinians as enshrined in international law. But the other thing that they keep, this is not only the question of integrity, intellectual integrity on the part of the media. No, there's more to it. There's a lot more to it than the question of integrity. It is also the question of, if you understand the centrality of the right of return for Palestinians, you will understand the collective mindset of Palestinians who are resisting in Gaza right now. You cannot detach both issues. Resistance has historically come from refugee camps, not just in the West Bank, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and also in refugee encampments in Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere. If you don't believe me, just look at the map of the current Israeli attack on the West Bank. Israel today declared that Israel is at a state of war in the West Bank. That's just today's news. Okay, look at the map of this war. Where is it centered? The Jenin refugee camp, the Tul Karim refugee camp, the various Nablus refugee camps, the various Hebrew refugee camps, and so forth and so on. it usually ends with the word refugee camps. So if the refugees are essential part of the resistance and the ongoing events, then an important question would be, isn't it important to understand why this whole right of return is so important to Palestinians? That it's compelling their action, compelling their resistance. And why is Israel trying to create another Nakba? Isn't this an acknowledgement that a first Nakba has indeed been created? And why Israel is keen on particularly ethnic cleansing Palestinians who are living in refugee camps. Right now, they are working to, they are saying, oh, this is temporary. But the people of Jenin and Tulkarem, they need to leave. Why do they want them to leave? So this is a question that goes way beyond the question of intellectual integrity and media objectivity and journalism and all of that, into a much bigger question by denying your audiences, your readers, your viewers, your listeners, a deep understanding of the issue of the Palestinian refugees. You are denying them a much better understanding of all the events that are happening until today. So when we say al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the continued Nakba, we're not just saying it's continued from an Israeli point of view, as in Israel continues to try to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, however incrementally. No, we are also saying that the resistance that existed during the times of the Nakba is internalized by the current generation, the third or fourth generation of Palestinian refugees, and they continue to behave as if the Nakba is not an event that has been assigned the archives of history, but is an actual, real, present event, and will continue to be the event, the main event that will measure the behavior of Palestinians as collectives in the future as well. Speaking of Palestinians as collectives, this is an issue that I have been pushing for years and years, which is any narrative regarding Palestine, any political discourse concerned with Palestine has to acknowledge the centrality of the Palestinian voice. Now, that at times is misunderstood because by acknowledging a Palestinian voice, it doesn't mean you choose any random Palestinian voice. Well, you know, she's a Palestinian, he's a Palestinian, therefore he has some sort of a right, an enshrined right to speak on behalf of the collective Palestinian experience. And I think that has to be upgraded. When we say centering Palestinian voices, we mean centering Palestinian voices that represent certain collective Palestinian experiences. So if you want to talk to Palestinians or about Palestine, you have to talk to those who represent the Palestinian experience of exile, i.e. refugees, Nakba, and resistance. And these are the voices of Palestinian refugees, and most of them exist in refugee camps as we speak, whether in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere. I feel like this is an important caveat that for anyone who is really interested to like, okay, well, let's talk about the Palestinian refugees, but what Palestinians? What Palestinians? And these are the Palestinians who deserve for their voices to be heard. Just finally, I would like to say that every attempt that Israel and Americans, the United States and others have done to dismiss or cancel out the issue of refugees has failed, because the issue of refugees, again, is not just the subject of a humanitarian question, it's a political question. And that political question is going to always be with us, regardless of whether we are in South Lebanon or in Gaza, in the West Bank, or in the United States or anywhere else in the world. That's it for me. I hope it made some sense, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments you have.
Okay, thank you very much for this insightful lecture. Our participants, you can send your questions to the chat bar to Africa Vakfı. But before switching to the questions from the participants, I have a question because I I have been following the Abraham Accords and the involvement of Jared Kushner and like figures like local figures like Mohammed Dahlan from Gaza, you know. Um, so one thing that is kind of striking is the fact that when it comes to the right of return, we don't see the involvement of Palestinians themselves. We previously had Arafat in the Oslo Accords, but since then, it seems like the significance of the Palestinians in these critical decisions is declining. So, how do you think the Palestinian Authority is responsible for this decline, or how do you relate the role of Palestinian Authority and its ineffectiveness, to be honest? I mean, so I'm being subjective, but this is what I observe. So, what do you think? I mean,
Thank you, Yusuf. It's a really good question. And I think quite often when we talk about the Palestinian Authority, we talk about it in certain contexts and we ignore other contexts. For example, we talk about the Palestinian Authority in terms of going as far as they are collaborating with Israel. They are cracking down on the resistance. They are not doing anything for Gaza. They are failing to achieve national unity and so forth. But we don't talk about the Palestinian Authority in terms of their impact on the historic Palestinian discourse, including that of the issue of refugees and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So, for example, when Mahmoud Abbas, in an interview, I believe it was with Haaretz a good number of years ago, I can't remember when exactly, but years ago, he did an interview with Israeli media. Again, don't cite me on this. It could be Haaretz, it could be Channel 12. In which he spoke about his right of return as a Palestinian refugee himself. He comes from the northern Palestinian town of Safad, very beautiful town, very close to the border of historic Palestine and Lebanon. And he goes, I have no plans to go to Safad. Basically, I forfeit my right of. Now, this is not about you, Mahmoud Abbas, as a person. Whether you go to Safad or you don't go to Safad, it's not the issue. The issue is it's about you as a representation of a people. So as the leader of a people, whether you wish to make the choice of going back home or not, you cannot cancel out the rights of millions of Palestinian refugees who want to go back to Safad, Al-Haifa, and Yafa, and Beit Daras, and elsewhere. The Palestinian Authority has not. So this is not, and I also hold myself responsible for this when I say, this issue of refugees was relegated till the final status negotiations that never took place. It seemed like I'm absolving the Palestinians themselves from that responsibility. And we can't do that. We shouldn't do that because the Palestinian Authority has not invested any time or efforts in indeed acknowledging or insisting on the centrality of the Palestinian right of return, the issue of Palestinian refugees, and so forth and so on. So when Jared Kushner comes to the Middle East and he says, you know what, Palestinians are not important. So he kind of jumps over the whole Palestinian component of the so-called conflict. He has done so because that's what Jared Kushner does. He's a Zionist, he's a friend of Netanyahu, and he does not want any kind of a solution that would acknowledge the minimum requirements for justice or peace that Palestinians perceive as such. But also because there was no pressure coming at him or towards him or anybody else. That, by the way, the issue of right of return is really, really important for Palestinian leadership because it's not. And they have done everything in their power to actually make it clear that for us, Palestinian leadership is not a central issue. So yes, the Abraham Accord involved many culprits that have tried to sideline and remove the Palestinians out of the Palestinian question. At least that's the term that the international community used to use back in the day, the Palestinian question, removing the Palestinian out of it entirely. But the Palestinian leadership itself has not made that a priority in the first place. And that's, I think, is another side to the crisis of relegating the issue of the refugees, but everybody is paying the price of that mistake. because by continuing to make that decision of ignoring the issue of the refugees altogether, you're ignoring that indeed that most of what you consider conflicts or crises or wars or even terrorism, per their own definition, it's all linked to the right of Palestinian refugees that have been neglected by all parties, including the Palestinian Authority itself.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have a question about UNRWA. It says, you have mentioned in your speech that UNRWA cannot undertake its political responsibility and protection. So how do you think the UNRWA can take such responsibility? What should be done to elevate UNRWA to such position?
Exactly. That's a really, really good question, and it requires more of kind of thinking aloud as opposed to offering an answer, because UNRWA was meant to be a temporary apparatus, a temporary humanitarian apparatus to deal with a temporary issue, but with time it became a permanent structure. Palestinian refugees were meant to be sent back to Palestine at the earliest, if I remember the term exactly or the phrase, the earliest practicable date. So we are here looking at a matter of weeks or months. Some of the stories that the earlier refugees in Palestine tell, and that's a story that was conveyed to me by my grandfather, is that when they left the villages, they did not want to take the new blankets and the new clothes with them because they did not want them to become so dusty and destroyed in the journey, because they are going to come back in the matter of a few days. In fact, some refugees didn't go directly to Gaza, didn't go directly to the West Bank. They just moved from one village to the other, thinking, okay, we're going to go, but and then the Zionists came closer, so they moved to a third village and fourth village. And many of the refugees that I have interviewed for my books, will tell you we moved to 6, 7 villages and towns before we ended up settling in southern Palestine, for example, in Gaza, because they really were under the impression that they were going back. So when UNRWA was created, it was created because it seemed that the issue of the refugees was going to take longer than anticipated. The first organization that came to the rescue was not UNRWA. UNRWA was not created until a mandate was given to UNRWA in the late 1949, and I think started operation January 1950. The organization that took charge, as much as it was accessible to it, was actually the Quakers. It was the Quakers that offered the early tents to the refugees and so forth. But it seemed that the issue of refugees was going to drag on a little bit longer, and that's where UNRWA got involved. But again, it was not supposed to be involved as a permanent structure. It was a humanitarian issue, a humanitarian organization. But with time, the organization that was supposed to facilitate and help and sustain welfare for those refugees until they go home became a permanent organization. And the issue of the refugees became a permanent issue as opposed to a temporary issue. The same logic, by the way, applies to the issue of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The term military occupation is not a swear word. It's not a bad term. It's a legal term. It's a term that was created by the Geneva Conventions to kind of create a system of governance. How should the occupying power conduct itself during times of temporary military occupations until the occupation ends? But Israel's military occupation turned from temporary to permanent. So this is the issue, is the issue of an organization that existed to serve a humanitarian purpose only for a short period of time, carrying on for 75 years or so. We don't necessarily, as Palestinians, want UNRWA to itself carry a political value. We don't want the heads of Western, the Western directors of UNRWA to become the political representation of the Palestinians. But we want an acknowledgement that UNRWA is there until the Palestinian refugees are sent home, because this is very confusing if you think about it. On one hand, you have organizations, countries, governments, states that funds UNRWA so that UNRWA may help the refugees. Good. But these very states deny the Palestinians' right to return. But how is that even rational? Because UNRWA exists so that the refugees may go home. You don't acknowledge that, but you acknowledge that UNRWA should be supported, as if the new political structure or the new political understanding of UNRWA is that that the refugee issue is a permanent issue, never to be resolved. Therefore, UNRWA becomes the representative of those refugees, but with absolutely no political value to that representation, as in the refugees having the right to exercise their right of return. This is the crisis we are dealing with, and that's the crisis that has to be handled.
At this point, we have a very relevant follow-up question, which says the donor governments, with 90% of the funds coming from the Western allies of Israel, which indeed, at the same time, arm Israel in its genocidal war in Gaza. So they're asking UNRWA to focus on development projects or reintegration rather than protection and return. So how can the agency's capability be developed to act independently? And is there anything that Palestinians can do to ensure this, or UNRWA is just like an illusion? What do you think?
Absolutely, it's almost like a illusion. I think it's a brilliant term. It's like indeed there's a magic trick involved here in all of this. On one hand, the very people who are sustaining UNRWA financially are the very people who are sustaining the very settlements, illegal settlements in the West Bank, that is pushing Palestinians out of their lands, thus creating more refugees to be supported by UNRWA, and so forth and so on. You give the bombs to the Israeli government that is bombing Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, and in South Lebanon. And at the same time, you give money to UNRWA to buy more stale bread and apples to Palestinian children, refugee children in the refugee camps. It is the contradictions of the West itself, its inability to enforce international law, and at the same time, and by the way, this logic applies to so much more. I mean, for example, you have Western states that acknowledge indeed that a two-state solution is the only solution. And for the two-state solutions to happen, the settlements would have to be dismantled because there are violations of international law. But by the way, we are also keenly interested in doing business with these settlements so that they may continue to economically thrive. And any call by the BDS movement or whomever that we need to boycott these settlements is considered an act of anti-Semitism. I mean, deal with these illusions. It's just a whole layers and layers of illusions. But what it really tells us here is the problem is the West itself. Is the West's double standards, intentional misinterpretation of international law, selective application of United Nations resolutions. Some applies to Ukraine, others don't apply to Palestine, and so forth and so on. It is this crisis. There's a crisis in international law invented by the West itself. And we Palestinians are continuing to suffer the consequences of that crisis. It's their dilemma. They have to resolve it in order for us to start taking the right steps in the right directions toward resolving the so-called conflict.
Okay. Thank you. So I think you have summarized everything, in the most comprehensive way, but we still have a question which says, do you think that creating international public awareness about Israel's violations of international law against Palestine could have an impact on stopping Israel's attacks? And adding to that question, my own question, as you know, the United Kingdom yesterday suspended some of its arms exports to Israel. Do you think that it was a result of creating international public awareness? Thank you.
Right. Our relationship with international law is a very interesting relationship, because if you ask a Palestinian, any Palestinian in Gaza, about international law, there is usually a term, a phrase that they use, and I've heard this phrase since I was a little child growing up in Gaza, which is, it's ink on paper. It's ink on paper. That's the term. حبر على ورق, doesn't have any value. Okay. And it's not because they have no faith in international law, because our relationship to anything, international law, the United Nations, humanitarian law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, anything is based on experience. Collective experiences over time. Collective experiences over time determines your relationship to anything and everything, regardless. And we have a relationship with international law that we always hear experts and talking heads discussing it on TV. We never see it implemented in real life, not even close enough that will tell us, well, at least there is a starting point. So this international campaign has been around for decades. Generations and generations of Palestinian intellectuals, politicians, diplomats, writers, academics, activists have been pushing for that, pinpointing the double standards, raising awareness, so forth and so on. And nothing is implemented except what Israel wants to implement, and nothing is implemented without American pressure, and that pressure has never taken place. Yet at the same time, we can't abandon it altogether, because it's a line of defense. I know it is devoid of actual practical meaning as we speak, but if you take that away from Israel, because Israel, no matter what Israel does in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, no matter what kind of new demarcations, no matter how they perceive the Palestinian lands or the status of the refugees, all of this is null and void according to international law. So with the International Court of Justice comes with an advisory opinion a short while ago, and really basically pushes the reset button on everything that Israel has done, from the West Bank, Gaza, the occupation, the status of Jerusalem, the refugees, reset button, as if we are back in 1948 or 1967. What this tells us, and it is infuriating for Israel, it's like, everything I have done to change the status of the Palestinians. I got the greatest country in the world, the most powerful country rather in the world, the United States, under the Trump administration, to acknowledge that the settlements are not illegal. The Golan Heights has, Israel has the right to annex the Golan Heights. It's not occupied territories. East Jerusalem is part of Israel, and so forth and so on. I brought the United States itself, and I had it acknowledge everything I wanted. It was like a genie granting wishes to Netanyahu. Yet at the end of the day, a few years later, the International Court of Justice presses that reset button and says, nope, everything is null and void, still occupied. So we need this. We need international law, because it is our fight for legitimacy. Much of the legitimacy that the Palestinian struggle has comes from international law, even though it has not fed a single Palestinian in Gaza and people are starved to death. It is, again, it's part of that contradiction. But just one quick thing I want to talk about when I talk about international law. A good friend of ours, Professor Richard Falk, who was the special rapporteur of the United Nations in Palestine for about 6 years. I interviewed him recently, and I wanted to kind of exact some kind of hope from him based on his experience in a place like the United Nations. And he said, listen, Ramzy, he said, in modern struggles, there are two types of wars that you can fight. One is the actual war that you fight on the ground: guns, bullets, tanks, airplanes, F-35s, and that sort of thing. And the other war is the legitimacy war. He says, in modern history, not once has any country or any people or any nation won the legitimacy war that did not actually acquire their freedom at one point in the future. And he said, from my experience, and that was even before this genocide in Gaza, when the solidarity with the Palestinians have increased by 100-fold, if not more, worldwide, he said the Palestinians are winning the legitimacy war. The legitimacy war from a global point of view. Now, if I speak to an Arab or a Muslim, a member of the global South, someone who shares similar anti-colonial experiences, we have other ways of connecting with these audiences. But at a global level, the legitimacy war would have to be won through international law. And we are winning that war. And that's why international law matters, despite the fact that it actually hasn't achieved anything practical as of yet to the Palestinians. But if you concede on international law, you lose a huge platform within that war that Falk refers to as the war of legitimacy or the legitimacy war.
Okay, so regarding this legitimacy war, by the way, I would like to remind that Mr. Falk was our guest 2 weeks ago, and he's a great person with a great knowledge on the issue. So regarding this legitimacy war, our last two questions combined. So first, what is the responsibility of the civil society? And second, how to cope with the portrayal of the Palestinian issue in the global media? Because we have like Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, TRT World, and I don't know, we have some other media outlets, but like the most read media outlets, let it be BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, ABC News, whatever. So, when you compare their language, current language with the language immediately after the October 7th, of course, there's a gradual change, but still, global media remains as a field of this legitimacy war, I guess. So civil society and media, what are their roles in this legitimacy war?
Absolutely. So here's a misconception that many of us have about the media. We suppose that the media is a rational creature that is being fed with certain information and have access to certain information, and then they produce content, regardless in what form, based on in an honest way, in a decent way, in a rational way, based on the information that they receive. And since they don't have access, say, to Palestinian voices or pro-Palestinian voices or the reality on the ground, as a result, the informations are always disinformation, misinformation, biased information, so forth and so on. But of course, this is not the case at all. Corporate media, by definition, are corporate. I mean, they exist for the interests of corporations. They are money-making organizations. They are not there because they are very concerned about how many members of the Baroud family have been killed in Gaza and what is this genocide, not genocide. They don't care about these things. They exist for the benefits of the shareholders and the corporations. As a result, there is no number of Palestinians would have to be killed in order for Western corporate media to become more humane. Whether the number is 40 or 40,000 or 400,000, nothing is going to change in their coverage. The supposed gradual change that we are witnessing is not actually a change in their coverage as much as a change that is consistent with the positions taken by the Western governments. So in the beginning of the war, for example, the Biden administration used to say, absolutely no stopping to this war, no ceasefire. They stopped any attempt at the United Nations Security Council to issue a resolution demanding ceasefire and so forth and so on. But with time, we reached a point in which Kamala Harris, we will support Israel, we will do everything that Israel wants, but it's time for this war to end. This gradual change that happened in the official position of the American administration is consistent with the gradual change that happened with the position of Western media. A very good start, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the work of Noam Chomsky, but manufacturing consent, really, which is more or less based on the theory of the the theory of hegemony by Antonio Gramsci kind of really explains why the media behaves in the way that they do. So the idea is not that the New York Times is going to become nicer to Palestinians. If you look at the archived articles regarding Palestine in the New York Times since January 1st, 1900, and by the way, it was part of a job I've done for several years, you will notice that New York Times, by definition, is biased towards Zionism and eventually Israel, and nothing has changed, and nothing will change. So counting on those corporate media to change is just not going to happen. We've tried. Generations of us have tried. But what I think we need to do is to offer alternatives. And that's why we need to invest in independent media, in independent voices. This is not the kind of thing that is going to be won by the media changing its perspective. It's going to be won by numerous outlets, independent media outlets, civil society funded outlets that are able to actually change the narrative over the course of time. And this is why social media has been a big problem for them, because you may silence a single newspaper, you may block the signal of a single TV station, but you will not be able to silence millions of social media activists in every possible platform. And this is as someone has said it in the beginning of the war, he said, this is not going to be a war that will be won by a decisive punch. It will be a war that will be won by points. And I think that the way that we should operate in the media through independent alternative media outlets over numerous platforms in every possible language all over the world, it will be the way to actually defeat mainstream media outlets and their coverage. If you don't trust me on this, look at how they covered the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. With mainstream media for a long time was sympathetic with the apartheid government until Nelson Mandela was released from Robben Island, and suddenly there was a complete change of consciousness about the issue. But it's not. It's politics, it's money, it's power, and it's the relationship between those who have the money and those who have the power. The same thing that applied to South Africa continues to apply to Palestine.
Okay, thank you very much. We are so happy to have listened to your great lecture, seminar, with some personal experiences, which were quite interesting. So we have covered from like what it is to be a Palestinian refugee to the role of the media, and then what to do with the UNRWA. Tonight we were together with Mr. Ramzy Baroud. Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your time and knowledge with us. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, and all the best to all of you. Take care.